My name is Sarah. I am 28 years old, and the day I turned 18 was supposed to be a milestone of freedom, but instead, it became the day my father completely erased me from his life. I remember the freezing rain soaking through my thin sweater as I stood on the front lawn of the only home I had ever known, staring in absolute disbelief at the black trash bags full of my belongings that he had just hurled out the front door. My father, Richard, a man who was now 56 years old, stood on the porch with a look of cold indifference that I will never forget, crossing his arms while his new wife smirked behind him. My heart shattered into a million jagged pieces, my chest tight with a pain so deep I could barely draw a breath. I felt entirely worthless, discarded like garbage by the one person who was supposed to protect me unconditionally. But as I dropped to my knees in the wet grass to gather my scattered clothes, a small, faded wooden box tumbled out of an old winter coat, spilling 20 seal envelopes onto the mud, each one addressed to my late mother in his handwriting. And as I tore open the first one, my tears stopped completely, because the secret written inside changed absolutely everything I thought I knew about my family. Before I dive into the dark depths of what those hidden letters revealed and the unbelievable journey of survival that followed, I would love to ask you a quick question to feel closer to you all. What city and state are you watching or listening to this from? Please drop a comment below and let me know, because it brings me so much comfort to see how far my story is traveling across the country and to feel a real connection with all of you. Sometimes sharing a painful past can feel lonely, but knowing you are out there listening makes a world of difference to me. Now, to truly make you understand the crushing weight of that freezing afternoon and the ultimate betrayal that destroyed my youth, I need to take you back to how this toxic nightmare actually began, long before I was left shivering on that suburban lawn with nothing but trash bags. Growing up in the quiet, tree-lined suburbs of Chicago, my life was sharply divided into two distinct eras: the warm, colorful days when my mother was alive, and the cold, silent years after cancer aggressively took her away from us. I was only 8 years old when she passed, leaving a massive, echoing void in our large home. For a while, it was just me and my dad. We were deeply bonded by our mutual grief, navigating the quiet halls of our house together, trying to figure out how to exist without her bright light. He would cook terrible dinners, and we would watch old movies, holding on to each other for survival. But that fragile bond began to fracture and rot the exact moment Brenda walked into our lives. Brenda, who is now 52 years old, was a woman who demanded the spotlight and controlled every single room she entered. When my dad married her just 2 short years after my mother's death, the entire atmosphere of our home shifted violently. The spontaneous laughter was replaced by incredibly strict rules, and the lingering warmth was replaced by an icy, calculated tension that made me feel like an unwanted intruder in my own childhood home. As the years dragged on, Brenda's subtle manipulations grew into blatant, daily hostility. She was a master of psychological torture. She would constantly criticize my appearance, mock my grades, and belittle my friends, always making sure my dad was in the room to hear it. And the absolute worst part, the part that slowly killed my soul, was that my dad never once stood up for me. He would just look away, bury his face in his newspaper, or make a quiet, cowardly excuse to leave the kitchen. I felt like a ghost haunting their perfect, pristine new life together. My only refuge during those suffocating teenage years was my best friend, Jessica, who is also 28 years old today. Jessica's house was a beautiful sanctuary of loud laughter, messy family dinners, and unconditional love. Her parents treated me like a second daughter, constantly inviting me over just to get me out of my toxic environment. It was in their crowded, warm living room that I learned what a real, functional family was supposed to feel like, which only made returning to my own silent house that much more agonizing. The suffocating tension in my house reached an absolute boiling point in the agonizing weeks leading up to my 18th birthday. Brenda would purposefully corner me in the hallway or the kitchen, making passive-aggressive comments about how real adults need to pay rent or find their own way in the harsh world. She would leave brochures for cheap apartments or military recruitment offices on my bed. I tried my hardest to completely ignore it, focusing all my energy on my upcoming high school graduation and my desperate plans to escape to a local community college. I foolishly thought her cruel words were just empty threats meant to ruin my mood. When I finally woke up on the morning of my 18th birthday, I didn't expect a grand surprise party, balloons, or a mountain of expensive gifts. I just wanted a simple, basic acknowledgement, maybe a quiet breakfast where we pretended to be a normal family for 5 minutes. Instead, I walked down the wooden stairs, my socks slipping slightly on the steps, to find Brenda and my dad standing rigidly in the kitchen, their faces set in hard, unforgiving stone. There was no cake. There was no happy greeting. There were only 3 black, heavy-duty trash bags sitting menacingly by the front door. I stopped dead at the bottom of the stairs, my stomach completely dropping to the floor as a wave of pure panic washed over me. I asked my dad what was going on, my voice trembling with a pathetic, naive hope that maybe they were just doing a massive spring cleaning of the hall closet. My dad couldn't even bring himself to look me in the eye. He stared fixedly at the floorboards and mumbled in a voice devoid of any emotion that it was time for me to face the real world, that I was a legal adult now, and they desperately needed the space for Brenda's new home office. I felt the air violently leave my lungs, as if I had been punched in the chest. I begged him, tears immediately springing to my eyes, asking how he could possibly do this to his own flesh and blood on her birthday. Brenda stepped forward, a deeply cruel, satisfied smile playing on her lips, and stated coldly that I had permanently outstayed my welcome. Before I could even attempt to process the monumental betrayal unfolding in front of me, my dad grabbed my arm with surprising force, shoved me out the front door into the freezing weather, and aggressively threw the heavy bags out right behind me. The heavy wooden front door slammed shut with a sickening thud, and the deadbolt clicked loudly. That metallic click sounded exactly like a gunshot echoing through my entire life, severing my past from my present. The freezing rain started falling almost immediately, a relentless, icy downpour that perfectly matched the absolute crushing despair swallowing me whole. I sat shivering on the wet, muddy grass for what felt like hours, completely surrounded by my entire life, haphazardly stuffed into cheap plastic. My mind was a chaotic, spinning blur of hyperventilating panic, profound sorrow, and deep, agonizing humiliation. Neighbors drove by in their warm cars, their windshield wipers flicking back and forth, actively trying not to look at the sobbing teenage girl abandoned on the lawn. Eventually, a raw, primal survival instinct kicked in through the numbness. I knew I couldn't freeze to death on the lawn of a man who didn't love me. I grabbed the slick, wet plastic of the bags and dragged them block after grueling block, my weak arms burning with lactic acid, my canvas shoes rapidly filling with icy puddle water, until I finally reached Jessica's house. When Jessica opened her front door and saw me violently shivering, completely drenched and emotionally broken into 1,000 pieces, she didn't ask a single probing question. She just pulled me inside, wrapped me tightly in a thick wool blanket, and held me on her hallway floor while I cried until my throat bled, and I physically couldn't shed another tear. Later that dark evening, sitting exhausted on the carpeted floor of Jessica's warm bedroom, I began the depressing task of sorting through the damp clothes in the trash bags to salvage what I could. That was the exact moment I found my mother's old, heavy winter coat. I had carefully packed it away years ago in the back of my closet, fiercely refusing to let Brenda throw it out during her many purges of my mother's memory. As I picked it up to dry it, a heavy, solid weight in the deep side pocket caught my immediate attention. I reached inside the dark fabric and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden box. It wasn't mine, and I had absolutely never seen it before in my entire life. My freezing hands shook violently as I pried the rusted metal clasp open. Inside, tightly bound by a faded, frayed red ribbon, was a thick stack of 20 sealed envelopes. They were all addressed to my mother, Emily, but the postmarks stamped on the corners showed dates from the years long after she had tragically died. My dad had been writing letters to a ghost. I carefully pulled the first letter from its yellowed envelope, the paper crisp and smelling faintly of his old cedar cologne, and began to read the cursive handwriting. The letters were a devastating chronological map of my father's pathetic cowardice and Brenda's insatiable malicious greed. In the early letters, written just months after the funeral, my dad poured out his immense, soul-crushing grief, telling my mother how much he missed her smell, her voice, and how he was desperately trying to be strong for me. He wrote about how much I looked like her and how it broke his heart every day. But around the 3rd year, right when Brenda entered the picture, the tone of the letters shifted drastically into pure panic. He wrote extensively about a terrible, catastrophic mistake he had made at his accounting firm, a massive financial error that bordered on federal embezzlement. Brenda, who worked as a senior manager at that exact same firm, had discovered his dangerous secret. The letters revealed the horrifying, undeniable truth. Brenda hadn't married my dad out of love or companionship. She had ruthlessly blackmailed him. She explicitly threatened to expose his crimes to the board, sent him to federal prison for decades, and forced me into the unpredictable foster care system unless he married her immediately and gave her total, unquestioned control over his finances and his life. My dad traded his soul, his dignity, and my entire childhood just to keep himself out of a dirty jail cell. As horrifying as that discovery was, it was the final letter, dated just a single week before my 18th birthday, that made the blood in my veins run completely cold and still. He confessed to my mother's spirit, begging for a forgiveness he didn't deserve, that he was about to commit his greatest, most unforgivable sin against me. He wrote extensively about the house, the very house I had just been violently thrown out of. I learned through his frantic handwriting that my mother's life insurance policy and a very specific ironclad clause in the property deed meant the house legally transferred entirely to me, placed into a secure trust in my name, the absolute second I turned 18. Brenda knew this all along. She knew she couldn't legally take the house or sell it while I was living there, and fully aware of my legal rights. Their sinister, calculated plan was to kick me out onto the street, completely disorient and traumatize me, and then, in a few days, have my dad reach out with a fake, manipulative olive branch. He was supposed to offer to co-sign a cheap apartment lease for me to help me get back on my feet. Hidden deeply within that dense legal paperwork would be a quitclaim deed, tricking my traumatized, desperate 18-year-old self into signing the $1 million house over to Brenda forever. I sat frozen on Jessica's bedroom carpet, staring blankly at the smudged blue ink on the page, feeling a profound, tectonic shift inside my own body and mind. The crushing, paralyzing sadness that had weighed me down all day suddenly evaporated into thin air, instantly replaced by a white-hot, razor-sharp, blinding fury.
I wasn't just an unloved, unwanted daughter being casually thrown away by a broken family. I was a target. I was the mark. I was the prime victim of a calculated, deeply malicious financial robbery orchestrated by the vile woman who made my life a living hell, and cowardly enabled by the man who was supposed to be my ultimate protector. I slowly looked up at Jessica, who had been silently reading over my shoulder, her eyes wide with absolute shock and her hands covering her mouth. I didn't cry anymore. My tears were permanently gone. I carefully folded the letters back into their original creases, placed them gently back into the carved wooden box, and made a silent, unbreakable vow right then and there. I was not going to be their tragic victim. I was going to meticulously tear their entire world apart, brick by brick. But sheer fury doesn't pay for expensive lawyers, and real justice is never, ever free. I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't confront them immediately without risking everything. I had to be incredibly smart, patient, and invisible. I had to build my armor and my war chest. For the next 2 grueling years, my life became an absolute masterclass in pure, unadulterated exhaustion. Jessica's incredibly kind parents let me stay in their unfinished basement, charging me absolutely nothing for rent. But I still desperately needed thousands of dollars to fight a massive legal battle against 2 corporate accountants.
I immediately got a brutal job at a local 24-hour diner, working the unforgiving graveyard shift under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. My manager, a tough but incredibly fair man named Bob, who was 45 years old and had seen his own share of hard times, let me pick up every single extra shift available. I would aggressively scrub thick grease off the industrial grills until my knuckles physically bled, serve endless cups of cheap coffee to drunk, rude college students at 3 in the morning, and force myself to smile brightly through the agonizing stabbing pain in my swollen feet and aching back. When I wasn't sweating at the diner, I was working the busy cash register at a dusty local hardware store during the daylight hours. I was surviving on maybe 4 hours of broken sleep a night, chugging cheap energy drinks just to keep my eyes open. I completely missed out on college parties, romantic dates, and the normal, carefree experience of being a young adult. Every single dollar bill I earned, every sticky quarter I found left as a tip in the Viner Diner booths, went straight into a high-yield savings account that I checked obsessively. It was a brutal, incredibly isolating existence that tested my sanity daily.
There were dark, lonely nights I would sit on my mattress in the cold basement, my entire body aching with deep fatigue, simply holding that wooden box against my chest just to vividly remind myself exactly why I was enduring this daily torture.
The burned-in memory of Brenda's cruel smirk on the porch became my unlimited fuel. I vividly visualized the exact day I would permanently wipe it off her face. Slowly, painfully, but surely, the numbers in my bank account began to grow, and my plan for absolute vengeance started taking a real, tangible, unstoppable shape. When I finally turned 20 years old, I had enough money saved to take the massive leap I had been planning for 2 years. Jessica spent hours helping me research the most ruthless, successful property dispute lawyers in the entire city of Chicago. That is exactly how I met Arthur, an incredibly sharp, no-nonsense attorney who was 62 years old and possessed a terrifying reputation for absolutely destroying corporate fraudsters in open court. I bravely walked into his intimidating oak-paneled office, a young girl wearing a worn-out thrift store coat, and confidently placed the carved wooden box directly onto his massive mahogany desk. I calmly told him my entire horrific story from start to finish, and then I silently let him read the letters. I sat quietly and watched his highly professional, stoic expression slowly morph into a deep look of absolute, unvarnished disgust. When he finally finished reading the very last letter, he slowly took off his reading glasses, looked me dead in the eyes, and firmly told me that not only was the house legally mine, but Brenda and my cowardly father had committed massive federal wire fraud by forging my signature on tax documents during those 2 years to illegally hide the trust transition from the government. Arthur and I spent the next 6 intense months secretly building an absolutely airtight, impenetrable case against them. We didn't just want to sue them for the property. We wanted to leave them absolutely no room to breathe, legally or financially. We subpoenaed complex property records, hired a brilliant forensic accountant to meticulously trace the forged signatures, and carefully documented every single lie they had brazenly told the county clerk. We soon discovered that Brenda, in her infinite arrogance, had taken out a massive illegal second mortgage on my house using the forged documents, recklessly spending the stolen money on luxury leased cars and lavish topical vacations, while I was literally scrubbing diner floors on my hands and knees. The sheer level of their greed and arrogance was staggering, but it was exactly the fatal mistake that gave us the explosive ammunition we desperately needed. Arthur meticulously prepared the immediate eviction notices, the massive civil lawsuit for fraud, and the detailed police reports for the district attorney. We were finally perfectly ready to violently spring the trap they never saw coming. On a crisp, incredibly clear Tuesday morning, Arthur and I drove in his sleek car back to my childhood neighborhood. It had been exactly almost 3 years since I was violently thrown onto that very lawn like garbage. My heart pounded wildly against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my hands were completely, unnervingly steady. We didn't bother to knock on the door like polite guests. Arthur had legally arranged for a stern, fully uniformed local sheriff's deputy to accompany us to officially serve the massive stack of legal papers. When the deputy aggressively rang the doorbell, my dad finally opened the heavy door. He looked significantly older, deeply tired and profoundly confused by the police presence. When his weary eyes finally landed on me, standing tall, confident, and unbothered in a sharp-tailored suit I had carefully bought from a high-end thrift store, the color completely drained from his face, as if he had seen a ghost. Brenda came aggressively marching down the hallway, loudly demanding to know who was bothering them at the door, but she froze instantly the absolute second she saw the shiny silver badge, and then her eyes locked onto mine. I didn't yell, I didn't scream, I didn't give them the immense satisfaction of seeing me have an emotional breakdown. I simply stood there with perfect posture and watched with cold satisfaction as Arthur firmly handed them a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. I spoke with a calm, icy, terrifying precision that I honestly didn't know I possessed until that very moment. I clearly told them that the letters my dad had cowardly hidden in my mother's coat had been found on the very day they kicked me out. I told them I knew absolutely everything about the blackmail, the secret trust fund, and the massive federal crimes they committed with the forged signatures on the second mortgage. I stood perfectly still and watched Brenda's arrogant, untouchable facade violently shatter into a million jagged pieces right before my eyes. She immediately started hyperventilating, screaming wildly that it was a lie, desperately trying to grab the papers out of Arthur's hands.
but the deputy quickly stepped forward, placing a hand on his belt, warning her sternly to back down. My dad didn't fight. He just completely collapsed onto his knees on the wooden porch, sobbing uncontrollably, burying his face in his trembling hands as the devastating reality of his unforgivable cowardice finally caught up with him. The legal and personal fallout over the next few months was incredibly swift and absolutely devastating for both of them. Faced with undeniable federal fraud charges and the concrete, irrefutable proof written in my father's own handwriting in the letters, Brenda's entire world completely collapsed. She desperately tried to throw my dad under the bus in court, loudly claiming he violently forced her into the scheme. But the forensic financial evidence clearly proved she was the sole mastermind behind the forged mortgage and the stolen funds. She was ultimately sentenced to 4 hard years in a federal correctional facility. My dad narrowly avoided actual jail time by turning state's evidence and fully cooperating with the authorities against Brenda, but he lost absolutely everything else in his life. He was publicly fired from his prestigious firm, his professional reputation was permanently destroyed, and he was left completely, hopelessly bankrupt. The civil court judge aggressively ordered them to vacate my property immediately, and the illegal second mortgage was entirely nullified due to the extreme, proven nature of the fraud they committed against a minor. The triumphant day I officially moved back into the house, it was completely, beautifully empty. I walked slowly through the quiet halls, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished hardwood floors. The oppressive, toxic, suffocating energy that Brenda had deeply infected the walls with was completely, permanently gone. I walked into the kitchen, standing on the exact spot where they had stood and tried to destroy my life, and I felt nothing but an overwhelming, profound sense of deep peace. I had fought relentlessly through the mud, the exhaustion, and the bitter, agonizing betrayal, and I had successfully reclaimed exactly what my mother had lovingly intended for me to have. I excitedly invited Jessica and her wonderful family over that evening to celebrate. We ordered cheap pizzas, sat comfortably on the floor of the empty living room, and filled the entire house with loud, joyful, healing laughter once again. As I looked around at the people who actually loved me, it was the very first time in 10 long, agonizing years that I truly, deeply felt like I was finally home. Looking back on that nightmare now, I realize with absolute clarity that true family isn't defined by blood or genetics, but by pure loyalty, unwavering honesty, and the rare people who actually stand by you when you are shivering in the freezing rain. My father tragically chose his own fear over his daughter's safety, and in doing so, he taught me the ultimate, most valuable lesson in complete self-reliance. I had to fiercely become my own protector, and through the scorching fire of that ultimate betrayal, I successfully forged an incredible life that no one can ever, ever take away from me again. If you discovered a dark, hidden secret that could completely destroy the people who deeply hurt you, would you use it to ruthlessly take your power back? Or would you simply walk away to find quiet peace somewhere else? Until the next story.